There is just one proposition on the ballot next month, but it isn't necessarily easy to understand. Ballot Measure 1 would create new laws surrounding development projects that could directly or indirectly impact salmon habitat in our state. And it does that in a couple of key ways. First, it expands protected waterways. Right now, state statutes protect more than 20,000 waterways. If Ballot Measure 1 is passed, it will assume all waterways are potential fish habitat and force developers to prove there aren't fish there. Secondly, it creates 3 types of permits, classifying projects as requiring either a general permit or being minor or major, depending on the potential impact to fish habitat. Now, joining me now to talk about the pros and the cons of the Ballot Measure 1, as written, are Polly Carr, Executive Director of the Alaska Center. She's with the Stand for Salmon Yes on One initiative, and former District Attorney Clint Campion. He's from the No on One camp. Thank you both so much for being here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And Ms. Carr, I want to start with you because I myself am unclear just how or who would determine whether a project is classified as major or minor in terms of its impacts.
Well, first, I just wanted to say that, Ballot Measure 1 is a response to the growing frustration that Alaskans around the state have had with wanting to have a stronger voice in the permitting process in Alaska.
So this revamps that process, and it does that by classifying projects as major or minor. And who does that classifying?
That classification is done with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And I think the most important thing in the changes that are being proposed with those permits is that we want to streamline the minor permits for projects that people are pursuing versus major permits for projects like the Pebble Mine, which could have significant impacts on our salmon habitat and way of life.
Is that an issue now with minor permits being held up because of those major projects?
No, I think that right now what's happening is that all of those projects are going through a similar process, and so minor projects, they don't have to face the same considerations in this new proposal. But right now, if you want to, make a change to your driveway versus put in a massive mine over the headstreams of a salmon waterway, you go through the same process. And this is an attempt to make it streamlined for minor permits and to make the major permits have to go through a more robust proposal process.
You mentioned Pebble Mine. Is this initiative in response to Pebble Mine?
This initiative is in response to the growing projects that have been happening in Alaska as we've developed as a state. And so it's in response to a habitat law. Our salmon habitat permitting law has not been updated for 60 years, and yet we've developed as a state over the past 60 years. And so we need that fish habitat permitting law to catch up to development across the state.
I want to turn to Mr. Campion now, because one of the biggest criticisms from supporters of Measure 1 is that fish habitat laws as they stand right now are only a few sentences in statute. Do salmon deserve more protection than that?
Well, the statute gives a great deal of authority already to the Department of Fish and Game, and the biologists and the regulators at the Department of Fish and Game have the authority and the discretion they need to protect our salmon habitat. And so as a result of that wide authority and discretion that they have, we have the healthiest salmon habitat in the world. Our Bristol Bay runs the last couple of years have been record runs. And so they do have the authority and the discretion that they need already.
What about this notion that they're outdated?
Well, the way that the law is set up, it does, like I said, give a lot of discretion and authority to the Department of Fish and Game, and then the biologists can use current scientific methods to enforce and to evaluate projects in the permitting process.
Well, on that note, we are going to have to go to a break right now, but coming up, we're going to hear from a fish scientist on what's happening with our king salmon runs in the state. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on Ballot Measure 1 with Polly Carr, Executive Director of the Alaska Center. She's with the Stand for Salmon initiative, pro Ballot Measure 1, and former District Attorney Clint Campion from the No on One camp. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Now, one of the notions that we've heard in the Stand for Salmon advertising is that we've seen low returns on king salmon throughout the state, and we spoke to a fish scientist about that this summer. I want to play a clip for you both to listen to. This is Jim Hasbrook of the Department of Fish and Game, and he he suggests that what's happening with those low salmon returns is happening out at sea in saltwater, not in the freshwater environment like Alaska's lakes or rivers. Let's listen to what he has to say.
It's something that's going on statewide. If it was a freshwater environment phenomenon, it would likely be something that would be much more localized.
Suggesting there that if it were something localized, we would be seeing it in a freshwater environment, but because it's statewide, he's suggesting it must be out at sea that we're seeing something happening to these fish. So, Ms. Carr, how would Ballot Measure 1 protect salmon when they're out at sea?
So I think that this argument is one of the sort of sources of mismessaging and misinformation by the people against Ballot Measure 1. Yes, there are many things happening out at sea and to salmon and to our waters that we don't know about, we can't control. I think the most important thing to remember, though, is that what we can control is having cold freshwater habitat in place, intact for salmon to return to. If we do not have adequate protections for salmon habitat, for cold water habitat in state, then when salmon are returning, they won't have a place to return to. So that's the more important question here. There's plenty of things we can't control out at sea. What we can control is the protections that we put in place for salmon habitat to return to.
And Mr. Campion, you've read through this, you say you spent countless hours reading through this initiative, and you foresee some unintended consequences here. What kinds of things do you foresee that are wrong with the way this measure is written?
Well, at a time when our state economy is at a low point, we've got a recession that's been going on for years. Unemployment is higher than it needs to be. If this measure passes, it's my opinion that this sends a signal to industry that it's going to be harder and more expensive to do business in Alaska. I think that's a clear consequence of this. And there are other unintended consequences, not just on industry, but on everyday Alaskans.
So besides industry and projects, so when it comes strictly to protecting salmon, Ms. Carr, what is it that's not working with the way our laws are written right now? What's the problem that needs fixing?
Well, there's a few problems that need fixing. I think the first one is that even though we've heard that we have this great permitting process right now, I think that's also a myth. Can you point to a specific example as to why? Well, what needs to be fixed is that right now the law has no clear definition for what makes good salmon habitat and what adverse impacts to fish habitat are. So when you are considering a permit or a proposal, that could be completely open to interpretation or political whims of the administration in place. What Ballot Measure 1 does is defines clear and consistent rules for salmon habitat protection by offering science-based standards that developers have to follow when they're doing a project in salmon habitat.
Some might argue that that system of major or minor is subjective. At this point, the ballot measure doesn't define what is classified as major or minor.
I think what the ballot measure does do is it defines what makes healthy salmon habitat. And so when someone is pursuing a project, they have to make sure that they are meeting that criteria, those science-based standards. You know, does this project allow for fish passage? Will this project allow for streamside riparian protection? Will this project be able to restore salmon habitat that it has impacted? I think that's the most important thing to remember.
So if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like this measure is based not on things that we've seen happen in the past that need fixing, but as a preventative measure for things that could happen in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in sum, Ballot Measure 1 is a way for Alaskans and not multinational foreign corporations to be in charge of our salmon future. This is a proactive measure so that we can ensure that, you know, my children, Clint's children, our grandchildren can grow up with salmon and continue the way of life that is so important.
On that note, Mr. Campion, it sounds like this is an initiative, a way for the public to be very involved in drafting these regulations. Why is that a bad thing?
It's not a bad thing. The problem is that it comes at too high of a cost at this time in our future and our history. And so my recommendation would be if Alaskans want to see more more robust permitting. That's something that the Department of Fish and Game can do under current law. But I am concerned about my children as well. And while I want my children to have salmon in their freezer and the opportunities that I've had, I also want them to have the economic opportunities that they should have in the future.
And this measure doesn't do that.
Again, my concern is that it sends a signal to industry and to the business community that it's going to be harder and more expensive to do business in Alaska if this measure passes.
All right, former District Attorney Clint Campion and Polly Carr with the Alaska Center, thank you both so much for joining us. Now, this ballot measure will be the only ballot measure on the ballot this November. A reminder that the general election is Tuesday, November 6th, and that will be your opportunity to weigh in on ballot measure 1.